The sound of polished leather hitting marble is a sharp, echoing crack, the kind that cuts straight through a person's chest. I remember standing there in the middle of that cavernous living room, the overhead chandelier spilling cold white light over everything, when my father flicked a crisp $100 bill toward me, like he was brushing lint off his suit. The bills fluttered down in slow motion, brushing my shoes before slipping across the floor. My suitcase handle felt slick in my palm from how hard I was gripping it. My father's voice boomed against the walls deeper and sharper than usual, every word slicing through the air like broken glass. My mother stood off to the side, the faint scent of gin drifting from her glass, her eyes fixed somewhere past me, anywhere but on her son. The radiator hummed low in the background, the only steady sound in a room full of everything unstable. I could feel heat rising under my collar, a mix of shame and anger I wasn't allowed to show. He said I was worth nothing. And the worst part was, in that moment, I almost believed him. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Evan Blake. I was 22, then newly graduated with an engineering degree from Stanford, a ceremony neither of my parents bothered to attend. I grew up in one of those old Boston mansions where the floors gleamed like polished ice, and the walls were lined with oil paintings of stern ancestors who all whispered the same message tradition: first individuality, last. My father, Richard Blake, believed that a Blake who didn't follow the family line into investment banking was a defect to be corrected or discarded. He wasn't an angry man by nature, he was worse. He was deliberate. Every word measured, every disappointment choreographed. You could hear it in his tone, cool as steel, every time he reminded me that my older brother had been the true heir, and I had been the experiment gone wrong. My mother floated through the house like perfume always present, never involved. She'd tap the rim of her martini glass when something uncomfortable was happening, a soft, nervous chime that meant she'd rather be somewhere else. She loved expensive events, polished silver, perfect posture, but loving her own son out loud. That was never part of the routine. I spent most of my childhood learning to read silences the way other kids read books. A pause at the dinner table. A sigh when I walked into a room. My mother's eyes sliding over me like I was a piece of furniture she hadn't ordered. The spring I graduated, the air around our home still carried that faint smell of fresh-cut grass and old dust. I'd spent 4 years studying something I loved, clean energy systems, and 4 years pretending that my family's coldness didn't bother me. I told myself they'd come around once they saw what I could do, that maybe success would make me visible. But the feeling had been building a tightness behind my ribs every time my father said, "When you joined the firm," or when my mother introduced me at parties as the one who tinkers with gadgets. The day everything snapped was hotter than usual for Boston. The house smelled like polish and old money, that sterile scent you never forget. I walked in holding my diploma still in the folder Stanford gave me. The edges felt warm from the sun. I wanted to show them. I don't know, maybe just one proud smile, one acknowledgement that I had done something on my own. Instead, my father didn't even look up from the stock reports spread across his desk. His voice came out flat, like he was discussing weather patterns. "Evan, you're an adult now. Time to stop wasting years on childish fantasies." He tapped the papers, that small, sharp click, before finally lifting his eyes. They were cool, unreadable, like he was evaluating a stranger. "You will report to the firm on Monday." The words hit me harder than I expected. My throat tightened, but my voice stayed steady. "Dad, I'm not joining the firm. I told you years ago engineering is what I want." There was a long, heavy silence. My mother set her drink down with that familiar glass-on-glass tap. My father exhaled once slow, controlled, and then stood up. His cologne smelled like cedar and power and a lifetime of expectations I had never met. If you walk out that door, he said, you walk out without the Blake name, without the trust fund, without a single thing we've given you. The room felt suddenly colder, like a draft had slipped through the windows. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. And then he reached into his drawer, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and tossed it at my feet like it was a verdict. That's all a failure, like you deserves. I stared at the money on the marble floor, the green ink sharp against the white stone. My hands trembled not from fear, but from the realization that there was no part of me left that he cared to understand. I bent down, picked up the bill, and tucked it into my wallet. The leather was warm in my hand. My father watched me with a smirk, confident this moment was the end of me. He didn't know it was just the beginning, and as I rolled my suitcase toward the door, the metal wheels clicking softly against the floor, I had no idea that the life waiting on the other side would change everything, including the power he thought he'd always have over me. The snow outside our house had fallen so thick that winter morning that the whole world looked muffled, wrapped in white silence. I remember pressing my face to the frosted window pane, watching the other neighborhood kids build a snow fort at the edge of our iron gate. Their laughter carried faintly through the glass, sharp and bright against the quiet inside. I had my gloves on, my boots ready, my coat zipped up to my chin. All I needed was permission. My father stepped into the foyer behind me, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. He didn't look at me. He almost never did when he'd already made up his mind. "You're not going out," he said, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. "You have piano practice." I remember turning toward him, the cold from the window still on my cheek, and saying I'd finished my scales early. My voice came out small in the wide, echoing foyer. He didn't answer. He simply opened the music room door, the faint smell of polish drifting out, and pointed inside. That was all it took. The door closed behind me with a quiet click, locking out the world of children and sunlight and crooked snowmen. My gloves stayed on my hands for hours, even as I played. Even now, decades later, that moment still drifts through my mind, like breath fogging up a window, an image I never seem able to wipe clean. It's strange how the body remembers things long after the mind tries to forget. Growing up in the Blake house was like living inside a museum dedicated to someone else's version of success. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. Everything had expectations attached to it. If you walked through the hallway too loudly, the sound bounced off the walls in a way that felt like disapproval. If you spoke during one of my father's conversations, his eyes would narrow just slightly enough to make your stomach twist. You learned quickly to read the atmosphere the way sailors read wind. Some days were calm. Some carried storms you couldn't see until they were already upon you. When I think back on it, the small hurts began long before that winter morning. They were stitched into the fabric of my childhood, like threads no one acknowledged. At birthday dinners, my older brother would be toasted for his future in the firm, while my achievements were treated like side notes. At holiday gatherings, relatives asked him about internships and leadership programs, while I'd be asked whether I still played with wires. There was a quietness to their dismissal, like they didn't even realize they were doing it. My mother would smile through all of it, passing dishes around her bracelets, chiming softly as she worked to keep every moment pleasant, at least on the surface. She had a way of tilting her head when I spoke just slightly, like she was listening, but not truly hearing. The scent of her perfume always reached me before her words did lavender, and something expensive drifting through the air like a reminder of the world she lived in, one I wasn't allowed to enter. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't unkind. She was simply elsewhere. I used to think the distance between us was something I could bridge if I tried hard enough, if I got better grades, won more competitions, made myself useful in ways she valued. But that bridge never built itself. No matter how far I stretched, she was always just out of reach. My father's presence in the house was a different kind of shadow. He had a voice that filled a room even when he wasn't shouting. His authority was a constant pressure in the air, the sort that could make a child straighten his posture without being asked. He loved structure, order, and legacy. To him, legacy was everything: a bloodline, a firm, a reputation carved into time. And I was the piece of that legacy that never quite fit. When I chose engineering, he looked at me the way one might look at a cracked tile in a perfect floor. Something flawed. Something that needed replacing. I remember one night in high school, the house smelling faintly of roasted lamb and rosemary from dinner. I'd stayed up late working on a small energy device for a science fair, the components spread across my desk like tiny stars under the lamp's warm glow. When my father walked by and saw the wires and calculations, he paused in the doorway. For a moment, I thought he might ask what I was building. I hoped for it desperately. But instead, he cleared his throat and said, "Make sure that doesn't interfere with your internship interview next week." Then he turned away, the scent of his aftershave trailing behind him as he walked down the hall. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing the ticking of my clock, steady and indifferent, as if counting down the seconds until I'd realized my path was invisible to him. By the time I left for college, I'd learned not to expect anything from them that resembled encouragement. When they dropped me off at Stanford, they didn't walk me to my dorm. My father checked his watch twice, and my mother reminded me not to embarrass the family. I carried my boxes alone, the California sun hitting the back of my neck as they drove away before I even reached the building entrance. Inside the dorm, someone down the hall was playing guitar, the notes floating lazily through the open window. The room smelled of new carpet and hope. For the first time, I felt like maybe I'd stepped into a place where I could breathe. But even then, the habits formed in childhood followed me. I stayed quiet in group projects, afraid of saying something foolish. I worked twice as hard as everyone else, convinced that if I wasn't perfect, I'd be dismissed. I didn't tell anyone when I won awards or published research papers. I didn't know how to accept praise. It felt unnatural, like wearing a coat that didn't fit my shoulders. The emotional weight of my upbringing wasn't loud. It was subtle, woven into the pauses between conversations, into the moments I hesitated before speaking. I'd flinch at tones of voice that reminded me of my father's disapproval. I'd withdraw from people who seemed too impressed by wealth or reputation. And every success I achieved came with a shadow, a whisper that maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe I wasn't enough. When I think about why I didn't stand up to my father sooner, the answer lies in those years of quiet shaping the small, constant ways I was made to feel like my voice wasn't worth hearing. Each childhood memory, each family dinner, each cold glance, or dismissive comment carved a little deeper into my sense of self. By the time I was old enough to fight back, I didn't believe I had the right to. But something changed the day he threw that $100 bill at my feet. Something in the air, something in my chest. Maybe it was the scent of mahogany polish mixing with the sharp edge of betrayal. Maybe it was the way my mother's eyes drifted away, pretending not to see what was happening. Maybe it was simply time for the quiet child inside me to stop waiting for the approval that had never come. What I didn't know on that day, as the iron gates closed behind me and the city air hit my face, was that the roots of those old wounds were about to twist their way into the present in a way I never expected. And the truth hiding in them was waiting to be uncovered. The folder slid open under the soft desk lamp, the pages giving off a faint chemical smell as they separated. I remember the cold of the metal drawer still lingering on my fingertips when I pulled out the stack of documents I wasn't supposed to see. My breath stalled as I scanned the first page, my father's signature at the bottom, the ink dark and decisive. The numbers didn't make sense at first: percentages, acquisition terms, shares he'd been quietly selling. Then a second document slipped loose and drifted toward the floor. I reached for it, the edge brushing my thumb like a paper cut waiting to happen. It was a memo. My name appeared on the second line. Severance from family trust irrevocable. My mouth went dry. Pages rustled as I flipped through them, each one revealing something worse. Debt. My father had hidden deals he'd made against companies I recognized, including the startup I'd once admired. And then I found the email thread. The glow from the screen lit my face with a cold bluish tint as I read the subject line regarding Evan's removal and long-term plan. For a moment, everything around me fell silent, except for the soft hum of the ceiling vent. It's strange how a truth can arrive like a fist, sudden breath-stealing, even when part of you always suspected it was there. When I stepped into that dim apartment hallway earlier that night, I thought I was just grabbing research notes I'd left behind. Instead, I found myself staring at evidence that reframed my entire childhood. The documents were spread across the small desk I'd set up near the window, the city lights casting a fractured glow across the papers. The blinds rattled faintly in the breeze, tapping against the sill like a warning I hadn't heeded soon enough. The first thing I uncovered was the financial report, a breakdown of the Blake & Associates trust structure. I'd known my father managed everything with iron precision, but I'd never understood the extent of it. The trust was supposed to be divided equally between me and my older brother. That was what they'd told me when I was 12, on a night when the dining room smelled of roasted chicken and expensive wine. But the report in my hands told a different story. My portion had been quietly reduced over the years, diverted into accounts that led to legacy investments tied solely to my brother's name. The earliest entry dated back to when I was 15. I remembered that year, the fights, the cold stares, the silence that stretched over weeks. I never knew the paperwork had been changing behind my back while I was trying to earn their approval with perfect grades. The next set of files carried a different weight altogether. These weren't financial documents. These were evaluations, psychological assessments written by a consultant my father hired. I recognized the name from a home office card I'd once seen on his desk. The assessments were about me, about whether I was fit to represent the Blake family in future business dealings. The consultant had never spoken to me, not once, and yet there it was, displays unproductive independence, resistant to directed career paths, demonstrates signs of misplaced intellectual interest. Misplaced. I could almost hear my father saying the word over breakfast while buttering toast, his tone cool and dismissive. The memory hit harder than I expected. As I read deeper, the betrayal sharpened. They hadn't just doubted me. They had planned for me to fail, or at least planned for me to be removed from any future that carried the Blake name. A long email chain revealed meetings with board members, dates and times carefully logged. Evan must be phased out gradually, one line read. His academic pursuits do not align with the firm's direction. Another message written by my mother took longer for me to process. She had always been passive, uninvolved, or so I thought. But her words were clear. Perhaps distancing him now will be easier than confronting it later. I had to sit down after reading that. The chair creaked under me, the texture of the worn fabric rough against my palms as I steadied myself. I'd never imagined she'd sign off on something like this. My mother didn't meddle in business. She just floated along the edges of everything, her presence more decorative than functional. But there, her name was tied to a plan designed to erase me quietly. The final document in the folder was the one that changed everything. It was a projected takeover bid proposal, a plan my father had drafted months earlier, outlining how he intended to absorb smaller firms, restructure divisions, and eliminate non-contributing entities. I almost didn't recognize the smaller company listed at the bottom. It was a startup I'd once interviewed with during my senior year. They'd turned me down gently, saying their budget couldn't stretch to a new engineer yet. I'd accepted that explanation. But the proposal said otherwise. My father had bought controlling shares in that company shortly before my interview. and in an email attached to the proposal he'd written, "Reject him. We cannot risk misplaced ambition. He must return to the firm." The air in the apartment felt suddenly too thin. I opened the window slightly, the night breeze cool against my face, but the tightness in my chest didn't ease. My father had sabotaged my opportunities long before he threw that $100 bill at my feet. He hadn't just pushed me out when I chose engineering. He'd been clearing the path back to his firm by blocking every other direction I tried to take. All those years I'd thought were filled with my failures, they weren't mine alone. As I pieced together the timeline, a quiet fury started to build. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was slow, steady, like coals heating under a fire that hadn't yet been lit. Every document connected to another, forming a web of decisions made about my life without my knowledge. It explained the rejections I couldn't make sense of. It explained the coldness that followed any sign of independence. It explained the tight, suffocating pressure I'd spent years trying to outrun. The realization settled over me like a heavy coat, unwelcome, undeniable. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had tried to script my entire future. I thought back to the cafe in Palo Alto, to the hum of espresso machines and the warmth of the late afternoon sun through the windows. That was where I'd first tasted the freedom of making choices for myself. But even then, I hadn't truly understood how far my father had gone to keep control. I felt my pulse quicken, a dull thud in my ears. The city outside buzzed faintly, car tires whispering along the pavement. It grounded me, reminded me I was no longer trapped inside the Blake house, no longer a quiet shadow moving through hallways of polished stone. I had built something of my own, something real, something powerful. And now, I had proof of the very machinery that tried to crush it. I gathered the documents, sliding them into a single stack. The paper edges felt cool and sharp against my fingers. Each sheet represented a decision they made without me, a choice to limit what I could become. I no longer felt sadness. What settled in its place was clarity, a clean-cutting certainty. If my father had spent years orchestrating my future from behind closed doors, then it was time to open those doors. Time to step into the room he never expected me to enter. Time to confront the truth with my own version of it. I stood from the chair, the floorboards creaking softly under my weight. Outside, a distant siren wailed, fading slowly into the night. I closed the folder, gently pressing my palm against the cover. The decision came to me quietly, but firmly. If they had planned my removal for years, then I would plan my return with the same precision. And this time, I wouldn't be walking through their doors as the son they cast aside, but as the man they never saw coming. The room fell silent the moment I placed the thick folder on the polished oak table. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmur of voices like a crack of thunder. My father froze mid-sentence, the stem of his wine glass still pinched between his fingers. The board members turned toward me, their faces shifting from irritation to confusion as I pulled out the first document and slid it into the center of the table. A faint rustle of papers echoed in the high-ceilinged conference room. Someone inhaled sharply. My father's eyes followed the page, and I watched the color drain from his cheeks. I opened the second document, the trust alteration he thought I'd never see, and let it drop onto the growing pile. The papers fanned out, each one heavier than the last, carrying truths he'd buried for years. My voice came out level, steady. "Let's talk about what you did." And that's when the temperature in the room seemed to drop, like the air itself was bracing for impact. But to understand why that moment mattered, I need to take you back to what brought me there. The days leading up to the confrontation felt like standing at the top of a long, dark staircase, knowing I had to step down one way or another. I spent nights sorting through the documents I'd uncovered, the cool glow of my laptop screen lighting the cramped apartment. The window rattled softly in the wind while I memorized the chain of decisions my father had made, the hidden accounts, the blocked opportunities the trust fund quietly siphoned off. The evidence sat heavy on my desk. Sometimes I'd press a thumb to the paper just to remind myself it was real. I didn't want revenge. What I wanted was truth laid bare, undeniable in front of the very people who'd been taught to see me as a disappointment. My father never gave me room to speak privately. He never respected anything unless witnesses were present. So I chose the one place he'd never expect to lose control, a quarterly board meeting attended by shareholders, senior partners, and his oldest allies. The setting itself felt like a stage built for him, floor-to-ceiling windows letting in a pale morning light, the faint smell of expensive leather chairs, the soft hum of the air conditioner vibrating through the vents. I arrived early, setting everything up while the room was still quiet. When I placed the folder in front of my seat, the table's polished surface reflected my hands, steady, no tremors. That steadiness surprised me. By the time the meeting began, the room buzzed with low conversations. Suits brushed against chairs, pens clicked, pages turned. I waited. Let my father go through his agenda. Let him bask in the sound of his own voice. Let him believe he still dictated the future. And then I stood. The sudden motion made several heads turn. I watched my father's frustration flicker as he lowered his speaking notes. His expression tightened the way it did when he thought someone was wasting his time. "Evan," he said, voice clipped, "this is a closed session. If you want to observe," I opened the folder. That was the moment the room shifted. The first document was the trust alteration, dated, notarized, and signed without my knowledge. It sat on the table like a stone dropped into a still pond. Ripples moved across the room. Mr. Hale, one of the oldest partners, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. His lips parted slightly. A woman across the table stopped mid-sip, the clink of her cup hitting the saucer louder than it should have been. My father stared at the paper, not touching it. His jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched beneath his cheek. "What is this?" he asked finally, though he already knew. I didn't answer. Instead, I placed the second document, the psychological assessments, on top of the first. The room fell into a deeper silence. The assessments looked clinical, unemotional, but the words were knives. Unfit, unsuitable, potential liability. A few people exchanged glances. Someone muttered something under their breath. Then I said it. "You hired a consultant to evaluate my worth without ever speaking to me." My father's face flushed. "You don't understand how business works." "No," I said. "I understand exactly how you work." I reached for the email's next printed copies of the chain where both my parents discussed distancing me from the Blake family future. When my mother's signature reached their eyes, a quiet wave moved through the room. She wasn't there, but her absence made it louder. Several board members knew her well enough to be stunned by her involvement. My father tried to regain control. His voice rose sharp enough to slice the air. "Evan, this is a private matter. Not anymore." And then came the twist. The one thing he could never have predicted. The projected takeover proposal, the one he had drafted complete with notes about restructuring, closures, and dissolutions, had a hidden section he didn't know I'd seen. A subfolder buried inside the company archive, mislabeled as internal audit notes. I'd clicked it by accident when gathering evidence. Inside were financial transfers from the trust fund, supposedly frozen into a private holding account under my father's name. But the account wasn't new. It had been opened 14 years earlier. I held up the printed ledger. The pages fluttered slightly in my grasp, the faint scent of toner rising as I flipped them toward the table. "You didn't just alter my trust. You drained it. The room erupted not loudly, but in sharp, broken fragments of shock. A chair scraped against the floor. A pen rolled across the table, clicking as it fell to the carpet. Mr. Hale whispered, "My God," under his breath. My father's face went bone white. That is not what it looks like. But it was exactly what it looked like, money that had been meant for me, redirected slowly over the course of a decade into accounts he controlled. And then came the real blow, the one thing that made the entire table turn against him. I placed the printed email at the center. The subject line read, "Contingency Plan for Evan's Failure Asset Transfer." Someone gasped. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, humming, like they could feel the tension building in the room. My father reached for the paper, but I slid it back out of his reach. "This," I said quietly, "is your signature? Authorizing the final withdrawal, 8 months before you told me I'd walked away from everything you gave me. You didn't give me anything. You took it." His mouth opened, but no sound came out. For the first time in my life, he looked small. The board turned on him slowly, like a tide shifting direction. Questions flew from every corner, calm at first, then sharp, then almost furious. The temperature of the room climbed. Sweat formed along his hairline. His tie hung slightly crooked, a detail I'd never seen on him before. "Richard," one partner said, voice trembling, "is this true?" He tried to answer, several times, but the words tangled, caught, dissolved. I didn't have to say anything more. The documents did it for me. Years of hidden interference, sabotage, theft, all of it laid in front of his colleagues, his allies, the people whose respect defined his entire identity. Eventually, the chairman spoke. "We need to adjourn. Immediately." My father reached toward me like he might stop me from leaving, but his hand hovered in the air, uncertain, trembling. I stepped back. The room was silent again, but not the silence of power he once commanded. This silence belonged to the truth. I gathered the folder, the papers sliding neatly inside. The weight of it felt different now, lighter somehow, like I was finally carrying only what belonged to me. As I walked toward this door, the carpet muffled each footstep, but behind me, the voices erupted again, not with admiration, not with loyalty, but with disbelief, anger, betrayal. Not toward me, toward him. I didn't look back. Part 5 would begin not with confrontation, but with the life waiting for me outside that room, a life no one could take away again. When I stepped out of that boardroom, the hallway felt strangely quiet, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the last echoes of raised voices. The door clicked shut behind me with a soft, final thud, and the sound traveled down my spine like the release of a weight I'd carried far too long. The carpeted floor muted my steps as I walked, each one lighter than the last. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, warm and gentle, a stark contrast to the cold fluorescent glare I'd just left behind. For the first time in years, my chest expanded fully without that familiar tightness. I paused by the elevator, hand resting on the polished metal rail, and felt it a quiet shift inside me, something steady, reawakening. I had entered that room carrying years of silence. I was leaving it with something different. My own voice. It took a few minutes before the shaking in my fingers settled and my thoughts found a calmer rhythm again. In a way, everything that followed happened slowly, like the gradual brightening of morning light across a windowsill. I returned to my small apartment, the one with the creaking wood floors and the faint scent of coffee that lingered from the cafe downstairs. When I opened the door, the familiar warmth of the room wrapped around me. The evening sun cast soft gold across the desk where I'd spent so many nights hunched over designs, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. I set the folder down, not with triumph, but with relief, a sense that I no longer needed the weight of those pages to prove anything. Reclaiming what was mine began not with money or titles, but with space. I cleaned the apartment from corner to corner, dusting shelves. I'd ignored opening windows that hadn't been lifted in months. Cool air drifted in, carrying the smell of damp pavement and fresh spring leaves. I scrubbed the tiny kitchen counter until it glowed under the lamplight. I rearranged books and notebooks, placing them in neat rows instead of the scattered piles they'd become. Those quiet actions felt like pulling thorns from under the skin, small, necessary, strangely comforting. The legal side of things unfolded steadily in the background. Attorneys I'd hired long before the confrontation began the process of restoring what had been siphoned away. Transfers reversed, accounts renamed, rights reinstated. I didn't ask for more than what was owed, and I declined anything beyond that. I didn't want the Blake empire. I didn't want their legacy. I wanted only the parts of my life that had been taken quietly, piece by piece. Dignity restored is more calming than wealth ever could be. My parents reached out, of course. First my mother, her voice breathy and measured when she left the voicemail, as if the softness might erase the years she stood silent. Evan, darling, perhaps we should talk. I let the message sit in my inbox. My father sent an email 2 days later, brief, stiff, a single line that carried more pride than remorse. We should discuss next steps. I didn't answer him either. Distance became my boundary, and I kept it as quietly as I'd once kept my pain. But in that quiet came something unexpected: support from the people who had nothing to gain from giving it. Co-workers from the lab who invited me to lunch simply because they'd noticed how tired I looked. A neighbor down the hall who knocked just to offer me a slice of banana bread she'd baked. And Laura from the cafe, the one who'd once handed me a free coffee when she saw how lost I was on my first week in Palo Alto, sent a text that read, "Only proud of you. Hope you're breathing easier tonight." Their kindness wasn't loud. It didn't demand anything. It filled the empty spaces in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Over the next few weeks, I found myself building a rhythm that finally belonged to me. I poured energy into the research project I'd put on hold, sketching ideas late into the night while the soft tap of rain hit the window. I moved into a new place, a modest townhouse with wide windows and a small patch of yard in the back. The first thing I did after setting down the last box was open every curtain and let the sunlight flood in. Dust motes drifted through the beams like tiny sparks. That afternoon, with the air warm and bright, I planted a single young maple tree in the yard. Its thin trunk bent slightly in the breeze as I patted the soil around its base. My hands were dirty, the smell of fresh earth rising around me, and I felt something settle in my chest. Planting a tree felt symbolic, yes, but not in a dramatic way. More like a quiet promise. Roots where I chose to grow them. Branches that would stretch in the direction I decided. Slowly, the heaviness that had clung to me for years began to ease. It didn't disappear all at once. Old wounds rarely do. But each morning I woke up in that new home, the light touching the walls in soft strokes. I felt a little more like myself. Not the version my father tried to mold, not the shadow my mother ignored, but the man I'd been becoming all along, even when no one noticed. There were evenings when I sat on the back steps with a cup of tea, the steam curling through the cool air, and thought about everything that had happened. The choices they made, the ones I made, the long path between those two things. The world around me felt calmer now, not because all the pieces were perfect, but because they were mine. Rebuilding, I learned, isn't always about constructing something new. Sometimes it's about clearing away what doesn't belong, making space for what does. It's about choosing honesty over legacy, truth over the illusion of family pride. It's about letting go with both hands so that healing has room to take shape. And in the quiet of those evenings, with the young maple swaying softly in the yard, I began to understand the journey in a way I couldn't have before. We spend so much of our lives trying to earn the love of people who were never capable of offering it freely. But there comes a moment, a single steady moment, when you realize you don't have to keep trying, that your worth was never meant to be measured by the people who refuse to see it. When that truth settles in everything after feels like a new beginning. And sometimes the life you build from that truth is the one you were meant to live all along.